They called it a land of savages. They said it had no history, no laws, no civilization. But deep in the heart of West Africa, there was a kingdom so powerful, so organized, so wealthy that Europe had only one choice: erase it. This is the kingdom of Dahomey. If you think you know African history, you don't. Not yet. Because what you were taught in school, what was written in textbooks, what was shown in museums, was carefully selected. Pieces were removed, names were changed, and entire kingdoms were reduced to footnotes. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the greatest cover-ups in world history. Stay with us, because this story will completely change how you see Africa, Europe, and power itself. Like this video, subscribe, and let's begin. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon of West Africa, this land was alive. It was not empty. It was not silent. It was not waiting to be discovered. By the 1600s, West Africa was home to some of the most sophisticated political systems on Earth. Cities thrived. Trade routes crossed the Sahara and connected West Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Gold, salt, textiles, and kola nuts moved through well-organized markets. Kingdoms rose, expanded, made treaties, fought wars, and built institutions the same way kingdoms did everywhere else in the world. To the east sat the mighty Oyo Empire, a Yoruba state with a cavalry so powerful it dominated the region for centuries. To the west, the Ashanti Confederacy controlled the gold trade with an iron grip. And right in the middle of this world, in the region that is today the country of Benin, a new power was quietly taking shape. A people called the Fan were building something. And what they built would last for nearly 300 years until Europe decided it had to go. The kingdom of Dahomey was born out of conflict. Around the early 1600s, the Fan people of the Abomey Plateau in present-day Benin began consolidating power under a royal dynasty that traced its roots to the kingdom of Alata. Early tradition holds that the name Dahomey itself came from a story of conquest. The palace was said to have been built on the belly of Dan, a rival chief the early king had defeated and buried beneath the foundations of his new home. But it was King Huegbaja, who ruled from around 1645 to 1685, who truly gave the kingdom its shape. He organized the administration, defined the borders, and began building the walled royal city of Abomey, a place that would become the beating heart of Dahomey for generations. Then came King Agaja, and everything changed. Agaja ruled from 1708 to 1740, and under his command, Dahomey stopped being a small regional power and became a force that other kingdoms feared. In 1724, he conquered the kingdom of Alata, the very place his royal line had come from. 3 years later, in 1727, he swept south and took Ouidah, also spelled Wida, a port city on the Atlantic coast. That coastal conquest was not just military, it was strategic genius. Dahomey now controlled direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. It controlled who traded through that coast, what came in, and what went out. In a world where the Atlantic trade was becoming the most powerful economic force on the planet, this was everything. Inside Abomey, Dahomey built a government that had no business being called primitive. The king governed through a council of ministers. A system of female officials, called the Kpojito, held real political power as co-rulers alongside the king. Oral historians, called the Huetanu, preserved the kingdom's records and traditions across generations. There were courts, taxes, a census system, and a standing army that was both disciplined and feared. This was not a village, this was a state. And then there were the Agoji.
If there is one part of Dahome's history that Europe worked hardest to minimize, it is this. The Agoji were an all-female military regiment, an elite fighting force that served the kings of Dahomey for nearly 2 centuries. Western sources later called them the Dahomey Amazons, borrowing a name from Greek mythology because they had no framework for what they were actually seeing. Their origins trace back to the reign of King Huegbaja himself, who first organized women as royal palace guards, a group known as the Gbeto, or elephant hunters. Over the generations, this group evolved into something far more powerful. By the time King Gezo came to power in 1818, the Agoji were not guards, they were soldiers, they were warriors, and they were terrifying. Under Gezo, the Agoji grew to between 1,000 and 6,000 fighters. By some estimates, they made up roughly 1/3 of Dahomey's entire military force. They trained relentlessly. They practiced hand-to-hand combat. They learned to use firearms. They conducted raids. They stormed fortifications. They took vows that separated them from civilian life and devoted themselves entirely to the service of the kingdom. European visitors who witnessed the Agoji train during the 1800s wrote about them with something close to disbelief. A French naval officer named Jean Bayol, who visited Dahomey in 1889, described watching a young Agoji soldier execute a prisoner as part of a military demonstration. Calm, precise, without hesitation, he was visibly shaken. These were not ceremonial figures, they were combat veterans.
And when France came to conquer Dahomey, the Agoji were waiting. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars of the 1890s, French soldiers encountered the Agoji in direct combat. They launched night raids on French camps. They attacked in coordinated formations. One account from a French soldier described waking in the night to find Agoji fighters already inside the perimeter. The French suffered real, significant casualties fighting them. The last known surviving member of the Agoji was a woman named Nawi. She was interviewed by a historian in 1978. She reportedly died in 1979, estimated to be well over 100 years old. She had been there, she had fought, and the world barely knew her name. Now, here is the part of this story that nobody wants to say plainly. Dahomey was powerful, Dahomey was sophisticated, and Dahomey was also one of the most active suppliers of enslaved human beings to European traders in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a fact. From the late 1600s through most of the 1800s, Dahomey raided neighboring peoples, the Mahi, the Bariba, other Fon subgroups, capturing men, women, and children and marching them to the coast. The port of Ouidah, which Dahomey had conquered in 1727, became one of the single largest slave trading ports in all of West Africa. Historians estimate that approximately 1 million enslaved people passed through Ouidah between 1640 and 1866. European traders, Portuguese, British, French, Brazilian, arrived at that coast with ships, guns, alcohol, and luxury goods. They left with human cargo. The kings of Dahomey, particularly King Gezo in the 1800s, depended heavily on this trade to fund the kingdom's military and government. Now, here is what Europe never wanted you to connect. After Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, British diplomats arrived in Dahomey pressuring King Gezo to stop. Gezo was reluctant. He said publicly that his entire economy depended on it, and he was right, because Europe had built that economy with him. But later, when European powers needed a justification to invade and colonize Africa, they pointed to the slave trade. They said they were bringing civilization.
They said Africans were barbaric, incapable of governing themselves. They used the slave trade as their moral cover, the very same trade that European merchants had funded, sustained, and profited from for 200 years. They created the fire, then they blamed the people burning inside it. By the 1880s, Europe had stopped pretending. In 1884 and 1885, the major European powers gathered in Berlin for a conference. Not a single African ruler was invited, and divided the entire African continent among themselves like a map on a table. It was called the Berlin Conference, and it was one of the most consequential acts of organized theft in human history. France had its eye on West Africa, and Dahomey was in the way. The tension between France and Dahomey had been building for years. France had established a presence at the port of Cotonou, and Dahomey disputed their right to be there. Trading rights were contested. The relationship was hostile. In 1890, France sent military forces under Colonel Alfred Dodds to settle the matter. What happened next surprised everyone in Paris. The First Franco-Dahomeyan War did not go the way France planned. Dahomey's army, including the Agoji, fought with a discipline and ferocity that French commanders had not anticipated. The Dahomey fighters used the terrain. They struck fast. They retreated, regrouped, and struck again. France technically won the First War, but they did not crush Dahomey. They signed a treaty that Dahomey's king, Behanzin, had no intention of honoring. Behanzin had become king in 1889, and he understood exactly what France wanted. He watched as French influence crept closer. He saw what had happened to other African kingdoms that had trusted European promises. He chose resistance. In 1892, France returned. The Second Franco-Dahomeyan War was larger, better equipped, and more brutal. France brought more troops and artillery that Dahomey's fighters could not match. But even outgunned, Dahomey did not collapse quickly. The Agoji launched night raids that cost French forces men and sleep and morale. The battles at Dagba and Cotonou were hard-fought engagements, not easy marches. Eventually, the weight of French firepower proved too great. The city of Abomey fell in November 1892. Before retreating, King Behanzin ordered the royal palaces burned rather than let the French take them intact. He continued fighting from the interior for another 2 years before surrendering in 1894. France exiled him, first to Martinique, then to Algiers. He died in Algiers in 1906, a king without a kingdom, thousands of miles from the land he had fought to defend. He was never allowed to come home. When French forces entered Abomey, they did not just plant a flag, they took everything they could carry. General Alfred Dodds personally oversaw the removal of royal treasures from the palace. Ceremonial thrones, carved statues, embroidered war banners, sacred objects that had been the living memory of the Dahomey royal dynasty for generations. These were not random items. They were irreplaceable. They were the physical record of a people's history and identity. The artifacts were shipped to France. They went first to the Trocadero Museum in Paris. Later, they were transferred to the Musée de Quai Branly, where they sat, behind glass, labeled with French captions, displayed for European audiences for over 130 years. The government of Benin, the modern country that sits on the land where Dahomey once stood, asked for them back, repeatedly, for decades. They were ignored. Then, in 2017, French President Emmanuel Macron made a speech in which he acknowledged that African cultural heritage held in French museums needed to be returned. It took 4 more years of negotiations, but in November 2021, 26 royal treasures of Dahomey were finally loaded onto a plane and flown back to Cotonou.
When the crates were opened in Benin, people wept. Many of them were seeing these objects for the first time in their lives, objects that had belonged to their ancestors, that told the story of who their people had been before the invasion came. 26 pieces, out of thousands still sitting in France. Here is what the history books left out, and here is why it still matters right now. The suppression of Dahomey's history was not an accident, it was policy. Colonial rule required a story in which Africans had no civilization worth preserving, no government worth respecting, no history worth knowing. Because if people knew the truth, if they knew about the walled palace of Abomey, the Agoji warriors, the sophisticated royal courts, the political systems that had governed millions of people for centuries, then the entire justification for colonization collapsed. So the story was rewritten. Textbooks written during and after the colonial period omitted Dahomey entirely or mentioned it only in the context of the slave trade. The complexity was stripped away, the power was erased. What was left was a caricature: Africa as empty, Africa as savage, Africa as a place that needed saving. In 1975, the country itself was renamed. The People's Republic of Benin replaced Dahomey on every map. The linguistic connection to the royal past was severed for an entire generation. The Republic of Benin today is listed among the world's least developed nations. It sits on the soil of one of history's most organized and powerful kingdoms. That is not a coincidence. It is a consequence. Colonization did not just take land and artifacts. It dismantled institutions, fractured identities, redirected economies, and left behind borders and systems designed to serve European interests, not African ones. Historians at the University of Abomey Calavi in Benin are working today to reconstruct what was lost, pulling from oral traditions, from archaeological sites at Abomey, from the accounts written by Dahomey's own record keepers before the invasion erased what it could. The royal palaces of Abomey were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985. They still stand, partially, a monument and a wound at the same time. Dahomey was not a myth, it was not a legend, it was real, a kingdom with walls and laws, with queens who governed and warriors who fought, with artists who carved history into wood and bronze, with a people who built something extraordinary and defended it until the last possible moment. Europe did not bury this story because it was unimportant, they buried it because it was too important. A civilization this organized, this powerful, this proud, could not exist inside the story Europe needed to tell to justify what it was doing to an entire continent. But history survives. It survives in the songs of the Fon people, in the return treasures now sitting in Cotonou, in the memory of the Agoji, women who fought a colonial army and made those soldiers afraid, in the name Bahanzan, a king who refused, who burned his own palace rather than surrender it, who died in exile still unbroken, and it survives in videos like this one. If this story changed the way you see the world, even a little, share it. Someone in your life needs to see this. Subscribe for more buried histories that deserve to be told, because the truth is out there, and it is more powerful than anything they replaced it with.